I'll ask that question.
The Zoning Commission meeting of November 14th, 2012, Ascension Parish Zoning Commission will now come to order. Madam Secretary, please note that the chairman, Mr. Burgess, is absent, and I'll be acting in his place, and all the other commissioners are present. We will forego the introduction of staff because you've just been introduced. Item number 5, acceptance of the minutes of the October 10th, 2012 zoning meeting. Gentlemen, what's your pleasure?
I move acceptance.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to accept the minutes of the October 10th meeting. Any objections? Motion carries. Item 6, chairman comments. The chairman has no comments. We'll go to item 7, a public hearing to consider a contract agreement for VFW Gonzalez Memorial Post 3693, located on the north side of Church Point Road, approximately 4,500 feet east of Roddy Road. Do we have someone addressing this? Okay.
Drainage and traffic has been met. He's asking for your approval.
And the whole point of this is to add 4 ballparks?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Staff has recommended approval. Any public comments? Any comments from the commissioners?
Was there, is there a drainage retention area in this to compensate for the parking lot and all that?
Yes, sir. It's on the back side of the fields.
Is it? I didn't see it on a plat, so I couldn't tell whether it was on. So there's not going to be any suggestion that this is going to further create a further drainage problem in the area?
No, sir. It's my understanding that
mitigated.
they're not going to add a whole lot of fill to this, that if it gets a heavy rain, these fields are going to flood, and they're going to do some stormwater, but they're not adding a ton of fill.
Okay.
That was my only question.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Chair will entertain a motion.
Move to approve.
Mr. Callender moves.
I'll second.
Second by Mr. Nizzo. Any other discussions? Any objection? Motion carries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Item number 8, a public hearing to amend the Ascension Parish Development Code zoning tables for recommendation for approval or denial to the Ascension Parish Council. The first one is 1213, calculating residential density on a parcel of land. This is something that we discussed last month, I think, and it changes the definition or the calculation for density. Comments on that from Mr. Compton?
Yes, sir. And I asked Mr. Aguilar to stay so he can give a good counter argument to this. He's good at arguing, and this is a good one to argue on. The currently residential density is calculated on a individual parcel of land on a gross site area. So if you've got 100 gross acres and you're zoned rural, so you're allowed 2 units an acre, you can build 200 units. This revision contemplates the idea of using a net area to calculate density. So if your 100-acre parcel of land is encumbered with, let's just use a nice round number of 50 acres. You've got pipeline servitudes, maybe you have unmitigated wetlands, an existing canal or water body. So you only have 50 acres of developable land. 50 times 2, you're only allowed to build 100 units because it's calculated on the net area. If you can't physically build a structure on it, you shouldn't be able to count it in your density. So I'm going to open the floor to Billy, because we just had a conversation here that potentially we could come to some agreement that maybe some percentage of that undevelopable land could be used in your calculation. I don't know today, right off the top of my head, what that percentage could be, because it could vary wildly from parcel to parcel. This is a starting point for how to calculate density. And when we get to the next couple of ordinances, you see sort of the progression here is that when we were going through our comprehensive plan process, one of the arguments we heard consistently over and over was how developers are allowed to stretch the density of an allowed parcel. They're allowed to use the PUD or the SPUD mechanism to cheat the zoning map, because our zoning, it really limits properties to 1, 2, or 3 units per acre. And my first statement was, well, if a property is encumbered with area that you can't physically develop, should you be allowed to use that when you're calculating the density? So that's where this revision came from, but I think it'd be good for you guys to hear Mr. Aguilar's side of the coin.
So now the counterpoint?
Thank you. I used the 50-acre example with Mr. Compton again a little while ago, but the thing is that a lot of this property, even if it's unmitigated wetlands, it still can be used as playgrounds. It can be used as walking and jogging trails, which is what people want in subdivision now, is some green areas to have recreation in. And if we're going to give up, if I got to buy the 100 acres, whether it's got servitudes on it or not, I need to be able to do something with it. And a lot of, for instance, Maplewood Development, which is one of the subdivisions I developed. There's a canal on the back, and some of it's in a floodplain, so we left it basically undeveloped as a recreational area for everybody in the subdivision to use. And we have, I think, if I just could use something for an example, I think the whole subdivision is 60 acres. 20 acres of it is in green open land. And there's nothing wrong with it. You can still use it. And I understand where Ricky's coming from. I mean, it's kind of wrong to say that if you got 50 acres that has servitudes on it for pipelines or power lines or floods or whatever, that you can only develop to 50 acres. You should only have 100 houses. I don't think you should be able to have 200 houses. But again, I don't think it should be limited to 100 houses. I think there's a happy medium here somewhere. If we can use something for a playground, and if it's something that you can't actually use at all, if it's a swamp, then take it out. But if it's a pipeline right away that you can put playground equipment on and let the kids play on it, put bike trails on it and walking paths, I think it should be utilized in part of the total acreage for the density calculations.
All right, so let me counterpoint part of that argument. Maplewood Estates, roughly 60 acres. Some portion of it was undevelopable.
That's what I said. It was
So, hold on, some portion. Did you get 180 lots?
No, it's only 110 lots in it.
110 lots. Based on our own zoning code, because of our minimum lot sizes, you can never get to 3 units an acre. You just can't. It's physically impossible. And what I'm simply saying is, because of our minimum lot sizes, and because of these undevelopable areas that are you just can't build them anyway, he got, what'd you say, 110?
110 lots.
So he's a little bit more than 2 units an acre, a little less than 2 units an acre. He'd have had 120 lots at 2 units an acre. He's a little less he's zoned 3 units an acre. I'm saying that the code is simply getting more in line with what you can actually construct. And why that's important is because when you get to the PUDs and SPUDs, those guys are the ones who, if they're zoned 3 units an acre, can go down to a townhome or a 40 or 50-foot lot and get to 8 or 9 units an acre, right? The code change that we're going to propose here later simply says whatever your base zoning is, that's the maximum you can ever get based on residential net area. Okay? So with a 70-foot by 150 minimum lot size in residential 3 units per acre, you're never going to get to 3 units an acre. It's physically impossible, regardless of how much area you have. A perfect square, it's not going to get to 3 units an acre.
Right, and I'm saying nobody's taking advantage of that. I don't think there's any subdivision out there that have 200 lots on 50 acres that's developable property, and they have 50 acres that's undevelopable. I don't think that's ever happened.
I don't think you can.
But if you can go, a PUD and a SPUD has to be reviewed by you guys anyway, whereas a regular standard subdivision doesn't. And I don't think any regular subdivision that we have in this parish has really taken advantage of that. I think the only people that might have taken advantage of it is a PUD or a SPUD, which they have the right to do that, but again, you guys have to approve it or disapprove it. It's up to
Ricky,
y'all.
why change it if it sounds like we have a fail-safe in place already, that we have a minimum lot size?
The people don't believe we have a fail-safe in place.
I feel like that's a fail-safe. Am I thinking about that correctly?
Well, where I'm coming
Minimum
from
lot size.
is we heard a lot of arguments during the comprehensive plan process, a lot of things that people didn't like. And one of them was the ability to use area that you physically can't build on when they're calculating density. And so, once again, this isn't coming, there's not a bull rush of developers coming here and this, that, and this is something we heard. I thought it was worth an argument, a discussion to sit here and talk about it. And I agree with Mr. Aguilar. If we could come to some agreement of, okay, maybe you can calculate, I'm going to say 25%, maybe it's a little higher than that, 50% of your unbuildable area and calculate that in with your net to sort of give some give and take here, then that's some negotiation that we can do.
But you see, you cook your own cake just now, because when you say there's a minimum lot size, that defines how many lots you can basically put.
That's the fail-safe.
That's the fail-safe. That's your
you
definition.
said
That's the
people-
fail-safe in the standard
In a standard
subdivision.
subdivision.
Because our PUD spuds refers back to density, we were changing this so that when you refer back to it, it's the same whether you're doing a PUD spud T&D or a residential a non-PUD spud subdivision. The PUD spud, somebody asked me, why would we do this? This is the whole point of a PUD spud. Well, I agree. In
kind
other
of
parts of
is.
the country, that's how a PUD spud is meant to be done. I think here they're not very well received because of the idea that they're using it to circumvent the zoning density that's allowed. So what I'm saying, if I do have my 100 acres and I am zoned rural, today I have to build a half-acre lot. I have to build a 100 by 200 foot lot, plus or minus. But if I want to do a PUD on my 100 acres, okay, because I want to build 50-foot lots, that's the product that's selling. I have to do a PUD to do that. But I'm saying I want to protect that area by the maximum number of units that are allowed to be built there. So that 100 acres is never going to have more than 200 units, or whatever the net area is if the code changes. So it's protecting the density that's been given on the zoning map through these couple of code revisions.
Okay,
The zoning map sort of gospel that we're going by, the 1 unit, 2 unit, or 3 unit per acre is being protected. If we don't want to use net area to do that, that's fine. I'm just saying that we could have some of these parcels, and I'm going to use Mossy Oak as a great example because Mossy Oak has, I would say, probably 30% of the property is just undevelopable. But they were able to use that in their area calcs, and yeah, we may have gotten a little bit more open space if they weren't allowed to build to that 3 unit an acre number.
But you still, it's a standard subdivision, you still got the minimum lot size. And the whole idea of a PUD spud is to do special things, and what this basically sounds like is just a means of killing PUDs and spuds. That's basically what you're trying to do, is saying you can't use a PUD. If it's a PUD or a spud, they gotta come to you guys, and if it's a public hearing, everyone in this parish has a right to come speak out against it. And it's up to you to vote to approve the PUD or the spud or not.
What developers want is certainty. And what you're not going to see is you're not going to see a developer come to you and spend $100,000 doing planning and doing due diligence to do a good project if they're not 100% certain that that thing's going to be approved. And what I would love to do is tweak the code so it's a little bit more palatable when they do come before you guys and go before the council and do have to go to these public hearings. They can say, hey, we knew coming in we couldn't exceed base zoning. We knew coming in this, that, or the other, right? But a developer's not going to do that with uncertainty. They're not going to do that if they don't know what's going to happen after they've spent that $100,000 in design and due diligence. It's just a fact.
Ricky, have y'all seen other parishes that are using this net rather than gross? Is this something that you just
I would say I've seen it in
Have you
other
seen it?
counties.
a couple?
counties, not parish. I just have a
just worried
question,
about us
something
here in
Mr.
Louisiana.
Billy said, and Ricky, you mentioned if not using just the net total property, maybe something, some percentage or something, but he mentioned there's a certain amount of property in the development that's just strictly undevelopable. If that's the case, why couldn't that portion of the property be not used in calculation? And like he says, if it's a pipeline or something that you can use for green space, but if you got a lake where it's not developable, you can't develop on a lake, why can't that portion of the property be taken out instead
I
of
agree
looking
with
for
you.
a
If there's an
percentage?
existing lake on the property and it's not good, of course you might utilize it for some kind of stormwater retention
Recreation
in the
and stuff,
future,
yeah.
but it can't be built on, and I agree with you 100%. That shouldn't be allowed in the calculations of.
I mean, we may
of
be
lot
looking for a
density. I agree with
percentage
that.
here, instead of trying to put a set percentage on it. If it's not developable property, then it shouldn't be used possibly to calculate the total density amount. That would kind of make it clear to everybody then. That when they come to look at it, you know you can't develop on it, you can't use it in the calculation. Would that kind of,
That's exactly what I'm saying. The issue was, what is that percentage? We simply listed all of those areas that aren't developable today, and the argument from Mr. Aguilar is, well, yeah, but if it's a pipeline, it's going to be green space. We should be able to count that. If it's a lake, we're going to put a trail around it. That should count. That all sort of counts. So then we're going to get into this fluffy area where we're sitting in a room and we don't
What's
know which
developable?
part of it is developable, which part isn't. If I can't get to it with the trail, then do I not get to count it in my density? All those sort of give and take. And once again, I'm going to get back. We used to use net in Orange County, Florida, because adequate public facilities, which I don't know if you've ever heard of, when you had to get down to the net, you'd have to less out this, that, or the other to calculate how much area you had to provide for public roads, for public parks, for public schools. So it's not a unique thing. It may be unique in this area, but using net area is not unique.
That's what I was asking. Okay.
Any other comments? Any other counterpoints?
You know, I think that we still, you know, I guess the final comment is that, you know, if it's a pipeline and it's a usable area for a walking trail or some kind of playground for kids or whatever, I think it ought to be used as calculating in the densities. And again, if it's a regular subdivision, you got a minimum lot size anyway. And if it's a PUD or a SPUD, it's got to come to you guys for approval in a public hearing to have it approved anyway. And I think there's only, what, maybe five PUDs or SPUDs in the whole parish anyway right now?
There's around 9.
So it's not something that comes up all the time. But a standard subdivision, you got a minimum lot size, so, I mean, to me, it's really, there's your fail-safe, it's really irrelevant to pass this ordinance.
And I would argue that these changes do not kill the PUD SPUD. The fact that the last 2 that have been proposed, that has killed the PUD SPUD, right? The idea that the developer didn't know going into the process that what they were proposing was going to get denied, and then they were both denied, and so anytime someone came to us after the fact and says, how do I do this? We sort of look and smile and go, well, you could do a PUD, but that's just going to get denied. I mean, how do you respond to that? It's
Yeah.
your only option is to do a
Take
PUD,
away-
but that will be denied.
You want to give more certainty up ahead,
Right.
up front.
I think the concern is in the calculation to remove that portion of the property that can't be used for anything other than what it is. Okay, I think the concern is what we're trying to identify in this calculation is to remove that which can't be used for anything for what it is. Let's say if it's a utility, what are you gonna do with it? So on one hand, while you're saying developable, where it means build on, I think you're looking at what's usable. It can be used for something. But then there are circumstances where some portions of that property, you can't do anything with it but what it's there for. Case in point, a utility. So is it worth it to probably calculate a value that takes consideration how much of this property I can't do anything with it aside from what it's used for? It's a utility. Can't do anything with utility. Is it worth it to do that and come up with some formula, percentage of, by looking at how much space it takes and remove that? Still, the rest of it is usable, develop, build, or in the case of your lake, it's recreation.
Right, you can use the lake for recreation. I mean, if
That's
it's
correct.
unmitigated wetlands, I mean, I agree with everybody. It shouldn't be allowed. You know, you shouldn't be able to use it. You can't build on it anyway. And if it's unmitigated wetlands, most of the time, it's something that's real low. It's way below the floodplain, and it's so wet most of the year that you can't even use it as a playground. I have no objections to that at all. But again, a pipeline or an overhead power line or something that you can still use as a walking trail or a jogging trail, I mean, it's something that you can use for green space. And it should be a consideration as the total density of the whole subdivision. And again, you still got the minimum lot sizes regardless. So,
Would you be minorly opposed or 100% opposed if a standard subdivision was required to have a certain percentage of its gross area as open space? See, here's the problem, is that today we don't require any open space. So if a developer happens to buy a lot that's got a pipeline running through it, and he wants to calculate that pipeline as part of his net residential area, we can't then require him to put a trail in it or a sidewalk. We can't require it. It's not part of the code. But if we had a minimum area within every subdivision that had to be open space, then I go back and I go, yes, let's count that pipeline as part of, you're going to have to put something in it. Therefore, I'll let you calculate it in your residential density area.
well, if you including storm drain detention ponds as open areas.
If there's a trail around it, I'll let you count it.
I mean, there's a servitude, usually there's a 15, 20-foot servitude all the way around it, so everybody can access the lake.
A paved trail.
Well, I'm not saying a paved trail, I'm saying there's a.
If it's inaccessible,
You can still, it's accessible from public
Or
servitude.
drainage servitude.
With a servitude all the way around the lake. I mean, it should be allowable as green space, and I have no objection to that. If I got a pipeline running through my place and I can use it as allowable green space, I have no objection to that. If I got say a 40-acre tract and there's no pipelines, no nothing on it, should they have some kind of playground for kids? I'd agree with that, you know. I'm only a small amount of it.
25%.
Nah, just kidding. Can I get my baseball bat out now?
I think we're back to lot sizes is the.
I think that's
Right.
the good fail-safe.
But, you know, Ricky, I don't know, you're asking me a question, that's a tough one. Some people would object to any kind of green space requirement at all. You know, me personally, I like green spaces. I think the family that want to move into subdivision want some green space. I think they want some walking trails if you can get them. I have no objection to that at all. That's me personally, but I think there's a lot of developers that are in here that are totally opposed to it.
Okay, Mr. Chafisa, you had a
I
comment?
just, it sounds like we're missing a formula here somewhere, you know. I'm not, I agree that although I think the original ordinance must have considered some unusable property when it when it came up with a density per acre, I mean, there's no piece of property that's 100% usable. I'm sure that there are servitudes, there's something to prevent every piece of property from being 100% usable. So that original density must be based upon some percentage of the property not being usable in the first place. My thought was that rather, use the net area to based on your current formula of what is it, two units per acre on rural.
Depends on your zoning, but rural is
Yeah,
2.
Okay, rural, 2. Then take the rest of the non-usable property and assign it some other number, like a half a unit for all the acreage in the non-usable area. I mean, you come up with some formula that seems to make sense. And you do have and that would give you something to base that on, and you do have a fail-safe, as we said anyway.
That's a great idea, and it just triggered the TDR concept, which is a transfer of development rights. And we could do some research and come back with you guys. And, you know, unmitigated wetlands typically are going to generate a higher TDR ratio than a pipeline servitude or an overhead utility. And so what we can do is we can come back to you guys with some numbers of how those TDRs would work on each individual case-by-case basis. And I
Here's
think
your
that's a great
percentage.
way to do that.
Sounds good. Good idea.
There's your percentage.
That'll work.
So can you
Come back
study
to
it
us?
again, come back to us?
Yep, just make a motion to bring it back next month, and we'll bring you some more information.
Then so moved.
Will that be for A, B, and C, are they all interrelated?
12, 13.
They're related.
Yeah,
We might as well. I mean, there's no
Yeah,
reason
I
to move
think
on one. We're not pushed for time on any of these,
Okay.
so that's fine.
So for all three, then you would come back to us next month with some additional information and another recommendation.
Yes, sir.
And I'll
Okay.
move to that.
Do I hear a
I'll
second?
second that.
Okay, any objection? Okay, thank you. Motion's approved.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Next is staff report. Anything else? Okay, item number 10, adjourn.
I'll make that motion.
Mr. Nizo, any objection? Meeting adjourned. Thank you, gentlemen.